AfriLabs-AfriHive Hangout. Thank you for hanging in there despite all of our unfortunate technical difficulties, but we're here and ready to go. So let's get started. So the purpose of this Hangout series essentially is to crack the hub sustainability case. Essentially. And this series, and this is the third and final one of the series, is really to serve as a listening exercise to understand the landscape of the problem and then identify areas where AfriLabs, AfriHives, and any other incentivized stakeholders can intervene. The format for this Hangout, or the topic for this Hangout, is actually two-pronged. So the first part of the Hangout will be devoted to discussing the pros and cons and differences between program versus operational / long-term funding. And then we'll move into kind of like an open brainstorming discussion around the way forward, essentially, or how to crack the hub sustainability case. So I'll get us started with a kind of quick overview of insights that emerged from the previous Hangouts, and then I'll hand it over to Marlon to lead the discussion about program funding. So in terms of sustainability, generally, there are a couple of interesting insights that at least I've picked up from the previous discussion. So one, and this is going to sound fairly obvious, is that one size doesn't fit all. So ultimately, what sustainability means and how a hub will get there will differ by hub. So an accelerator like CITIC Dakar, or for an accelerator like CITIC Dakar, revenue sharing makes sense, but for a pre-incubation space like ICE Cairo, for example, which is offering a public good to social innovators with limited disposable income, their users are not necessarily going to be their customers, and so they have to be, they might have to employ a cross-subsidy model or think of other ways to generate revenue that is separate from their primary mission. Additionally, in thinking about what sustainability means or how to define it, it's not necessarily just about being profitable or being able to cover all of your costs alone. Sustainability can mean having a long-term plan to stay open, even if part of your funding or a good part of your funding comes from grant or donor sources. The next point is basically know thyself. So it's important for a hub to understand what it is, what it does, and what value it offers to key stakeholders. You know, to have a clear reason for existing and to understand what its unique value proposition is vis-a-vis other hubs. It's also important to diversify funding sources. So there's an inherent risk that comes from having a single source, whether it's a grant or revenue. So if you're able to source funds from multiple, or if you're able to generate revenue or solicit grants from multiple sources, that diversity makes you more resilient. And then, of course, the answer to creating a sustainable business model is ever evolving. So what works when you have a brilliant plan about what you're going to do, and what works in year 1, year 3, year 5 could change. So a hub has to be flexible and respond to market feedback in terms of what's working and not working, and be willing also to try a bunch of different things to see what sticks and double down on what doesn't. In terms of promising opportunities for revenue generation, I'm sure there are many, but a couple of highlights from one of the conversations here at Accelerator are revenue sharing and growth margin sharing. Seems like an interesting avenue. And for hubs generally, including accelerated value-added services such as consulting, research, creating targeted programs for specific donors, or providing services to donors such as facilitation and event hosting seem like reasonable avenues. So at this point, I'll start yammering on and hand it over to Marlon, and, unless there are comments or questions about what I've just said. Okay, in which case I will hand it over to Marlon to lead us in the discussion about program versus operational funding.
Great, thank you, Tayo. So just I guess a brief sort of two-sentence introduction on who I am and why I'm here today. Um, I am actually a researcher. I work on management studies and entrepreneurship at the University of Cambridge. And my current project is looking at Kenya and Nairobi's innovation hub ecosystem. And I spent the summer at iHub as a research fellow, mapping out sort of the different innovation hubs and looking at their business models and trying to understand this new organizational form. But before coming to Cambridge, I was actually a donor relations officer with the UN Refugee Agency. So I've previously worked with governments and large foundations to manage sort of their donations to UNHCR. And I'm really interested to hear today about sort of how innovation hubs, which are a little bit different to classical not-for-profit or social enterprises, are managing this sustainability challenge. And so today, as Tayo said, sustainability means many things, but I think today we're trying to focus on financial sustainability. And I thought just to sort of start us off, because I think what we're trying to do today is to understand what does this financial sustainability challenge actually mean, not just to people who run hubs, but also to users and to funders and just to all of these different stakeholders, and how can we manage that in a way that works best for innovation hubs. And I thought that to start us off and to sort of get everyone on the same page in terms of terminology, I just really briefly go over sort of some of the literature on third sector funding and just the distinctions between core funding, program funding, and project funding. I think we all sort of know this, but I think it's helpful before starting off discussions to sort of talk a little bit about terminology. So when we talk about core funding, we mean sort of very regular donations, very regular income that covers sort of the day-to-day, so staff costs, office rent, utilities, and just regular services. And then project funding, sort of the other extreme, which is sort of granted for a very specific project for a limited duration. It might be sort of earmarked to a theme, a short little project, a short little workshop, something like that. And then in between sort of core and project, we've got programs and program funding, which is sort of targeting specific larger programs, so it could be multiple projects, but the scope isn't as broad as core funding. So often program funding is still limited, and organizations aren't able to cover rent and staff costs, all this operational all these operational aspects with that funding. So that's sort of very roughly the distinction. I think that's classically sort of, from what I've seen, is what most hubs are dealing with, but I'm obviously happy to talk about this. And yeah, just to get us started, I've sort of got, unless there are any questions sort of about what I've just talked about, I'd love to just jump straight in with the first question. But first, are there any questions or clarifications or sort of things I didn't mention that people think are really also relevant in terminology?
Marlon?
Yes.
I hate to do this, but I actually neglected to invite people to introduce themselves so
Yes.
on the Hangout. So if you don't mind, could you maybe run us through a quick introduction before we move to the questions? Sorry about that.
Totally. No, that's a great idea. I think it'd be great if everyone briefly just introduced themselves and also maybe said a sentence or two about what they're hoping to get out of this Hangout today and what they're hoping to discuss.
Great. Maybe I'll get us started.
Yeah.
In the interest of efficiency. So as you probably all know, my name is Tayo Akinyemi. I am director of AfriLabs. I'm here because I'm pretty incentivized to figure out how to help my members become sustainable. And I'm hoping by having this dialogue and approaching this challenge from multiple angles. The angle we're talking about today, obviously, is the difference between the types of funding and how that affects sustainability. That will figure out basically how to support the sustainability journey.
I can jump in here, say hello to everyone. I'm Bahia Yasmin Robinson. I'm Executive Director of Africa. We do a host of things. We advise accelerators. We have our own accelerator and incubator. Hive Collab was one of the first tech hubs that was founded in Kampala, Uganda, which we actively advise, and we're very keen on staying a part of the conversation about how this whole sustainability theme is going to continue to evolve and grow and also kind of deepen a little bit, because there's definitely some issues that we believe still, solutions that still need to be found around sustainability, to Marlon's point, kind of in each bucket. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Bahia. Maybe Mo, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Muhammad Radwan, or Mo, and I am a co-founder of ICE Cairo, which is, as Tayo mentioned earlier, could be classified as a pre-incubator. However, we are, really tied into the ecosystem in Cairo and really close to a lot of incubators and accelerators, and it's part of the Egypt co-working MILGA is what we call it, and extremely passionate about trying to find a sustainable model for either hubs or incubators, because everyone in Cairo is struggling with this. And from what we understand, even like a lot of spaces in Europe and definitely in the rest of Africa are facing a lot of the similar challenges. And and we have a lot to contribute to the conversation, and we like to share it. And that's it for now.
Yeah, so I guess I'll go last. My name is Michael Kimathi. I'm a community development manager at C4D Lab. We have been also struggling with sustainability kind of model that you should adopt. And today I'm here to learn a couple of things that I can adopt and take back to my team and see if it will work out.
Thanks, Michael. I think we have one more person, if Debbie's still in the building. She had connectivity issues last time, so I was hoping she'd have a better experience, but it seems not. So, Marlon, I'll hand it back to you. If others join, then we can introduce and integrate them as we move along.
That sounds good. Thanks. Yeah, so I've basically outlined a couple of questions, but it sounds like we're all coming from very different backgrounds. So it'll be very interesting to hear sort of what the funding models are that you guys currently have or are working with, and then sort of perhaps outlining what are the strengths and also what are some of the issues and things that need to change. What's the actual challenge? I'd be really interested in hearing that, just to sort of start off our debate, and then maybe we can go into sort of more broadly talking about, well, what are the strengths and constraints that come with core funding, that come with program funding, that come with different sources. So for example, I visited C4D Lab actually. Michael, I don't think I met you while I was there. But I think it's really interesting to put a hub in a university context. Maybe you can talk a little bit about sort of what, because you said you're really thinking about this whole financial sustainability issue and are experiencing some challenges. Maybe just if you could very broadly sort of briefly outline the journey that you guys have had since you started up, which hasn't been too long ago, if I'm not mistaken.
you're right, Malin. Most of the time, I'm not in there physically. I work remotely most of the time. So for us, it's unfortunate we have no donors at the moment. We have been trying to reach a couple of partners, but we have not seen that give back so much of returns. So what we have decided to do right now, because in the university and our strength is knowledge, we have knowledgeable people around who actually have PhDs. Some of them are pursuing the same PhDs. Some of them are experienced professors. So our strength lies in knowledge, and realizing that we have formed a very good foundation in the last quarter of 2014 on doing research. We are working with the government, we are working with Microsoft and other stakeholders to carry out research with the team so that we can generate some revenue. We have also applied for other research so that we can do them. So that's basically what is working as actually training, which actually we are starting in January in CISA and other network certification. We have been carrying out throughout this year about cybersecurity training, which actually went well. But we want to increase because we're all piloting everything that we are doing. So that's the two channels that are working, though we are looking to see how those two can trickle down to other things that we would like to do, such as community development, incubation, innovation. We're also pursuing something with the university to see if they can dedicate some funding where we can have some agreement with the innovators, the startups that are incubated, and see the partnership that we can have to commercialize the idea, as well as we fund them to see how that goes. So it's something you're pursuing, and maybe by mid next year we'll be able to see how that comes about. So that's what we have done so far at C4D Lab, and I would like to see more what we can pursue maybe from this hangout.
Yeah, that sounds great. It sounds like you guys have really taken a very sort of diversified approach. Is there did other people take other approaches, or is that sort of the strategy everyone's pursuing with the hubs that they're involved in?
Hello. Maybe I can talk a little bit about ICE Cairo, and I can mention actually other ICEs, since we have a few more examples. But I'll just begin. I mean, I think your question was kind of what are the strengths and what constraints we have around the funding. So let me just begin by saying that ICE Cairo began with 100% support from the GIZ in Cairo. And this month we have reached 0% funding from the GIZ. And within this time frame, we've looked for alternate forms of generating income activities, and have searched for other partners, key strategic partners. And we've reached, I mean, we've achieved in partnering up with other organizations, but not for the same amount of financial support that the GIZ provided. So actually right now we are not funded. Right now we are, I don't even think we're actually bootstrapping. I wouldn't even go, I think that's a little bit extreme. I think we're somewhere in between, but not that, you know, I mean, we're not that, our revenues aren't that high. I mean, yeah, I mean, we're on the border of bootstrapping. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is we've, in the past 2 years with GIZ and the kind of funding that we've been receiving, there was a lot of bureaucracy that we had to deal with, and that took up a lot of time. So I would say this is one of the constraints of the funding, where we had to prove through certain administrative requirements, you know, the funding, and that would take up a good percent of our time. I mean, one of our co-founders, or my other co-founder, spent a good 70% of 2013, a good part of 14, working out a lot of this bureaucratic nightmare. So, I mean, that was one of the biggest constraints we had in the funding. And then, but I think what we've come out of that, and what that allowed us to do in the past 2 years, I mean, in a way, it was like seed funding for us, because it allowed us to play around with a lot of different models, and to kind of focus on what we think is good as far as achievable for a financial model going into our third year. But what we'd like to bring soon to the table and invite a lot of people from AfriLabs is to conduct, and we're going to announce this soon, it really hasn't been announced yet, we're preparing some literature to sound out to a lot of people internationally, but definitely locally, to see where we're gonna pivot, and we're gonna do this in a very public way. We're gonna be so transparent. We're gonna throw out all our numbers, all our like accounting. We're just gonna throw out to everyone in the ecosystem, and then ask them, as the only green tech innovation hub and as a pre-incubator, we're gonna come out the ecosystem and say, what value are we missing here? Because we feel in Egypt that even though there's a lot of players and stakeholders within the ecosystem, that it's just not up to par. We're pushing a lot further, and we really want to, like, I don't know, really get to the root causes of why we're just not producing the kind of entrepreneurs at the level that we want to see, namely the global level. I can talk about this for a long time. I don't want to I don't want to get into too much detail, Marlon. Cut me off as you're facilitating. And if you want me to be more specific in my answer, let me know at any time. But yeah, so I'll just really briefly go through like some of our income streams and that are based on our strengths. We have a really cool space, and what we found out with trips with AfriLabs to Republica and through the ecosystem here, is that a lot of spaces make a bunch of, big chunk of the revenue comes in from space rental. So, having people have events over at our place, or just coming out and renting the space for whatever purpose they need. And that's because it's a really cool, inspiring place. So that's one of our strengths. Our physical location is just badass. Anyway, so then we got, we also, last time I mentioned that we provide certain services like facilitation to larger organizations. We also are in 2015 going to continue with our plan to manufacture products. And so we had one lined up for 2014 with a few versions of prototype, and we're actually going to come to market with one or two in 2015. And here you can see now that we've started to divide kind of our activities. We had the more on the public goods side, where we're really supporting a lot of entrepreneurs, and then we have a business side to kind of cover costs for the whole operation for that that social enterprise, and that would be coming in through sales revenues and from these products. Finally, we have things like the use of FabLab machines. People come in to they want to 3D print something, or they need something laser cut, and of course workshops and trainings. So these are our main revenue streams, and I consider these to be our strengths. The last thing I want to say before I hand it over is that we have an example of another hub in a university. That was ICE Addis, and I don't want to speak for them because I think they're in transitional phase, but what I understand right now is that they're moving out of the university, and they have and they're becoming more of an incubator, and they are now so that some things worked in that situation, other things didn't, and we are advising people who want to start an ICE in southern Egypt to stay away from the university, because we feel that there could be a lot of bureaucratic problems. In Egypt, for example, there's a lot of politicization in the academic realm, and so to have that independence to freely explore different revenue models or any kind of activities, you should be independent of the system. Okay, that's it. I'm going to hand it over.
Great. Thank you for that very detailed sort of explanation and insight into how you guys are managing sort of your various income sources. Something I found very interesting is you were talking about how you almost had a shift. Sort of in the beginning, your seed funding was very much donor oriented, and then you diversified a little bit and are generating revenue. I don't know if others have also had a similar switch, but I think if we think about Hub's business models, that's very interesting, because how do you manage that switch from being entirely supported by donors to generating revenue on your own and creating services such as a consulting arm and renting out your space? I don't know if others also have any insights on that, or also on other aspects that they'd like to share.
Just to jump in there, I mean, I think there's a lot of kind of key insights from Mohammed's overview. I think one thing to kind of mention, I think we all know this, is that the ICE model, which is fantastic, and I've spent a little time with Mohammed and other ICE members. I went to ICE Addis a few months ago. So it is fantastic what they're doing, but the fact that they even have this like 2+ year seed funding to kind of figure out what works and what doesn't is, I mean, I don't want to say a luxury. I mean, I think every hub should have the opportunity to have that space to kind of, figure out what's going to work in their particular market, test some assumptions, because you're dealing with a few things. You're dealing with starting this enterprise, right? Because you have to kind of look at, starting a hub as its own enterprise. What are you selling? Where's revenue going to come from? How are you going to diversify? You have, this set of questions that need to be answered. But then you're kind of, working against the clock of either paying rent or making sure that, Wi-Fi stays on. Obviously, there's, can be infrastructure issues, again, depending on the place. So, I think Tayo and I, because we're kind of looking at hubs and supporting hubs from a 30,000-foot viewpoint, have really been trying to push both donors as well as, for-profit tech companies, et cetera, to really support this kind of seed stage exploration time, of this 2 to 3 year period where hubs can really kind of figure these things out, right? Because otherwise, what's been happening is that you're, again, working against a clock, but you're trying to provide this public good, and you're trying to figure out what goods and services you can sell and that are going to be, useful. Then there's also a competitive advantage, because in most cities now, let's face it, they're now, where 5 years ago there might have been just 1 or 2 hubs, now there's 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. So everyone's kind of working to target the same donors, the same tech companies, et cetera, to kind of reel in that operational money. So, I mean, I'll pause there, but that's just some reflections from the ICE kind of model, which, again, I think is fantastic, and I think it's given ICE Cairo and others kind of a foundation to, or a little bit of wiggle room, breathing room, to figure out, what could work in their market and what would be, best both for the community of entrepreneurs and supporting them and building their businesses, but also for the hub itself as its own business. So there's like 2 things happening, right? You're supporting other businesses to be successful, but then that supporting of businesses is its own business. So, it is kind of a complex cocktail to address.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I just to play a little bit of a devil's advocate and sort of spice up the debate a little bit. I guess one question is if we advocate for a funding model where hubs are given sort of a 2-3 year period, in which they're sort of sheltered in financial terms, and then where they're sort of free to try out. After those 2 or 3 years run out, and you've sort of got all your programs sorted, you're running, your users have expectations towards what you're offering, and especially what you're offering for free. how do you then transition into something that's self-sustainable? And I mean, from at least from what I've gathered, but I might be entirely mistaken, that's a big struggle, is sort of that switch from being donor driven or donor supported to, you know, really building services.
I mean, again, from my perspective, I think it's two things. I think, again, with GIZ and the ICE model, which is so phenomenal, it's like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mohammed, on any of this, but you know, there was an investment not just of money, but just of, you know, other support, non-financial support, and kind of figuring out some of these things and helping, you know, test some assumptions. Again, I mean, I think that in my experience in the last few, you know, 3 or 4 years, there's some donors that are very much invested, not just from a financial perspective, but also from a development, right, a business development perspective. And I think those organizations, both for-profit and nonprofit, that have that level of interest in developing the actual, you know, enterprise and supporting the entrepreneurs instead of just kind of either having it as a write-off or having it as a programmatic focus, have been much more successful than ones that haven't. But again, I mean, these things are changing because now there are more hubs in, you know, many markets across the continent. And so, again, it kind of gets a little bit tricky to kind of, you know, talk about hub support as a blanket statement. I think the model that really works for Nairobi, because there's government support, there's private sector support, and public sector support, looks very, very different than Kampala, looks very, very different from Accra, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And it just kind of depends on the matrices in each of those regions and each of those, even those specific cities. So again, I'll pause there, but that's just my first kind of thoughts.
I did want to just respond to a little bit of what Bahia said. And I think it's important to note that even though we were initially funded for 100%, within 12 months of that funding had come down to about 55%. So for the past year, for the second year of funding, we've only had 55%. And the idea there was actually, I mean, this was a plan initially, to kind of, you know, kind of gradually decrease the amount of support, which would give that extra push to the core members into, and kind of apply that pressure into kind of innovating the solutions that were required in order to be ready for the end of the year when funding reaches 0%. But what I wanted to say is also that so my question to actually anyone who's been researching and has been around and in contact with a lot of different hubs, it was my understanding that a lot of these hubs do have a lot of support, whether it's public sector or from international aid agencies or private sector. And I'm wondering how many are already can claim that they're self-sustained financially. That's a question I just wanted to pose to the group here. And the second thing I wanted to talk about was the fact that, so one of the constraints, I like to talk about this a lot because I mentioned this in Windhoek in 2013 when we all met there for, a bunch of people met there for the e-learning conference. A lot of people were asking about GIZ support, and I said, you guys really got to watch out because they really come in with a very strong development kind of attitude to this this industry. And I'm sorry, is it Marlon? Marlon, yeah. And Marlon just asked about how that transition from free to paid services can be. And so it was very important for us from the beginning not to adopt that development kind of mentality and attitude when approaching our community, even though, as Tayo had mentioned, they're young Egyptian entrepreneurs in, you know, pretty broke country, you know, and they can't really afford any services. They had to save, you know, the 60 cents to get on the public bus to come to ICE Cairo, let alone paying for an hour of co-working or some of the workshops we have. So, but we still had to get everyone used to, you know, there's no free rides actually, and it's just going to get, you know, more expensive from here on out. So it's kind of conditioning everyone that these services are going to cost money. And then as the demand has grown, we've gradually raised some of the prices of our services. but then we've also realized that we're going to actually start targeting a different market. So this was very important as well. And this is where we introduce some the ICE bites, where we allow people to work or contribute to ICE Cairo in several different ways in exchange for credit that then they can use on some of the services. So this non-monetary currency system, if you really can't pay for the services that we offer. But it was also important for everyone to understand we would really, really like you to pay for those services because we need to sustain ourselves. Not everyone can be running after ICE bites. But anyway, so this was very important to the, I think relevant to this discussion. I'll pass it on, pass the baton on.
I just wanted to jump in with one or two comments. So to echo a little bit what Mo is saying. So when people talk about scaling, for example, scaling enterprises of any kind, traditional for-profit or social impact or impact-focused enterprises, people sort of say you can't expect to achieve scale if you don't design for scale from the beginning. And I think it's similar with respect to sustainability. So you can't necessarily start with a plan that is static in terms of sourcing all donor funding and expect in 3 years to be sustainable. So I think part of the challenge, and Mo highlighted this, is making sure that you are planning towards sustainability even if you are largely donor funded at the beginning. So that means saying, okay, well, we anticipate that we're going to need that 2 or 3 years of runway to experiment with revenue streams, but then you actually have to experiment with revenue streams and figure out what works and doesn't work and evolve your model as you go, which is what ICE Cairo is doing. I mean, the problem with that is there's not a predictable outcome. There will be failures, and the failures will be painful both for the community and financially. So this isn't sort of like, a shiny, happy dance to prosperity. But I do think that it is important to build in that experimentation from the very beginning.
Yeah, I think, thanks. This is some really interesting points. I think what's also emerging is almost sort of this question of, well, what does financial sustainability mean? And I think I'm sensing sort of two different answers to that. One being, well, sustainability is if the user is paying for the services, and then sort of, which is sort of, I guess, the corporate idea of sustainability is you sell a service and a good and customers buy it. But then I think in hubs, what we also see with hubs where we generally sort of interpret that they're financially sustainable because they're no longer fully dependent on donations. There's also this idea that users are sort of the beneficiaries almost, and there's sort of other services that are generating revenue, so research arms, consulting arms, sort of other things that hubs are beginning to offer in order to sort of still make sure that the services are offered for free. I don't know what people's thoughts on that were, particularly then sort of coming to, well, what do sustainability and funding models mean for users? Because I think that's what we're sort of starting to touch on. And I was curious to hear sort of what people's experiences were with user experiences at hubs and with the change in user experience, and also I think a change in expectation, particularly in contexts like Nairobi where there's so many different hubs and so many different services being offered that I think there is sort of an expectation towards what hubs are supposed to be giving that's emerging among sort of the broader user community.
So maybe I'll jump in here again. I mean, obviously, I'm not running a hub. So take my insights with a grain of salt. I'm just speaking from what I've heard from members. But there definitely seems to be, and this depends on how the hub defines its customers versus users, but there does seem to be a separation in many cases between customers and users, mostly because many hubs are providing services that could be considered public goods. So Lukanga from Bongo Hive, for example, who was on the first Hangout, kind of described the evolution of what Bongo Hive does. Because there was a very nascent tech community there, they had to invest a lot of time, energy, and finances, frankly, to building the actual community. It's hard to monetize community building. I don't know if anyone's done that. So that was not, so in that case, they were serving their users, but hadn't identified who their customers might be because their users did not have the financial wherewithal to be customers. But over time, they've identified what value they can add to other stakeholders apart from their users, who are the developers, startups, et cetera, and provide value-added service to them, and so they are customers and they pay, and arguably they're used in a different way, you know, if you're hosting events. But I think that's an important distinction, and John, also in the first Hangout, described this as having a cross-subsidy model. So you have people that you're trying to serve, but those people may not actually be able to pay for your services, so you need to have another segment to whom you're providing services that can be, from which you can be compensated for.
Could I step in? Hello, everyone. I'm Tony Elias, calling from InfoDev in the US. Hope you can hear me well. I'm obviously a person who represents the other side of the table. Basically, those of you who don't know InfoDev, we've been supporting business enablers like incubators and such entities for the past more than 10 years. And in particular, looking at the hub network that's grown in Africa, we've been very much involved ourselves there. We've, for the past 4 years, we've supported a global network of M-Labs and M-Hubs, a couple in Africa, including the M-Lab in Southern Africa. We provided funding the seed capital for the M-Lab in Nairobi. Then we've also provided funding for a couple of the M-Hubs, which were very kind of experimental, very small scale, oftentimes based on a Mobile Monday model, and then work with other incubators in Africa region as well, such as the CITIC Dakar, as well as a couple of few other ones. So I can talk more about some of the cross-subsidy issues that Tayo just raised, because one of the good aspects of being a donor and being able to provide funding as well as other support to a number of labs and hubs around the world is that we've actually seen quite a few models on how they work. And it's not only the digital agenda. We've been working also in the climate innovation and climate technology area, where the actual climate innovation centers that we've supported are much larger. You know, they go into like multi-million-dollar projects with their own seed financing component. So we've really experimented from and supported from like very small type of entities to large entities, which I think is quite interesting. And then having this donor role is something that I still try to keep my feet on the ground all the time. And then personally, I do have a history of actually being set up an organization that initially started as a donor-funded organization, and then we switched into a boutique consultancy, strictly provided consultancy services. So I kind of understand both sides of the table at the moment pretty well. And there was a point about, I think Mohammed made a point about the bureaucracy, for example, that you know, ICE Cairo was required to go through during their period of going through the seed financing from donor. And I mean, one point I wanted to make is that I know how hard it can be to provide all the reports and go through all those bureaucratic loops. But at the end of the day, there is a certain accountability that comes to the table, since at the end of the day, you're using a taxpayer's money. So it is many of the politicians, they need to, at the end, they need to justify to their own taxpayers why this money is being used in this country for this project. So they need to be able to show what the value is to their own citizens. And I think this is always the point that I'm trying to say, is that there is a certain reason for the bureaucracy. And you should look at the good points. I think a couple of them were mentioned already. So oftentimes there is the non-financial support that comes with the financing. I think Bahia mentioned it. So, for example, in InfoDev's case and in my case with the MLabs, at times I've had locally based consultants working aside with the lab managers, making sure that they help to lower the bureaucratic hurdles and help with streamlining and making the reporting more efficient, for example. And then, but supporting lots of the business development aspects, supporting lots of the other aspects that help the labs to survive and grow. And then also, one thing I would really recommend the different hubs and labs to keep in mind when it comes to donor money and the bureaucracy is that if you look at then, you're discussing about a certain funding amount, whether it's $100,000 for argument's sake, do make sure that you already from the start carve out a certain part of that money into the bureaucracy. So don't think it comes as an additional cost. But if you have a $100,000 negotiation with a donor, for example, take 10%, 20%, it really depends on the reporting requirements, audit requirements, or how much administration is needed. And make sure that you don't count that money as as a funding to be used in your programming or as a core funding. So then you don't feel that there's so much bureaucratic hurdle, because you already know that you will be hiring perhaps a new person that's required, or at least you can pay a part of a salary of yourself or M&E person or someone else. So I think those are the kind of points that I wanted to make talking about the bureaucracy. But what I've seen, another point that was discussed was the seed state financing and the model where the hubs and labs have been using the donor financing for the first couple of years as seed stage financing, and at the time trying to test and experiment what their business model is, adjust, experiment again. And trust me, I've seen how it works, and I know it's not easy. And that's the key question: how do you then switch from the initial seed financing into more sustainable revenue streams? I think it actually seems to be working out pretty well, as long as people from the start know that this is strictly 2 or 3 years financing. I generally recommend, because for example, InfoDev, we raise our own money from government donors that then we select our partners on the ground that we then support at the end of the day to use that money. We usually mention that 2 to 3 years is too short of a time, but during the 2 to 3 years, at least we can see which teams seem to be working very well, which are the teams we may want to support going forward. There might be some teams, and there has been some consortium issues, for example, in the past, where 2 to 3 years we haven't really seen any results, we haven't seen our projects being picked up. So it's much easier for us then to say that let's rather support those who may not be succeeding and becoming sustainable in the first 2 to 3 years, but at least we see that there's the fire in the belly, they're motivated, they're really innovating with their business models, they're serving the beneficiaries at the end of the day. And then like at the moment, we're discussing with a couple of the labs that we supported in the past to come in as a follow-up financing on the table in Africa. So I think another point that I wanted to mention about the seed finance stage is that my recommendation sometimes to the labs and hubs is that it doesn't mean that you have 2 to 3 years time to provide your services and do not look at any other revenue streams. My advice is always that start raising money, start charging for your services as early as possible, and then at the end of the day you can always put that money aside, build a little reserve for yourself to help you to bridge the gap between the seed financing or donor financing and then self-sustainable revenue streams, or you can then invest it into some other areas and start growing your business. But it doesn't make sense to operate the first couple of years purely based on a donor financing and then start thinking about, well, okay, now there's a switch coming in 6 months. That's not going to work. So always start charging as early as possible from those customers that can pay for it. And that's where it comes to the cross-subsidy model. At the end of the day, I've seen some labs and hubs that are trying to do everything. So they're trying to support the community, and oftentimes the community doesn't, there's not enough money, so they actually need to figure out how to subsidize that service. There are some other services that have been subsidized. In some cases, it's been training or something else. And if they then are also acting as an incubator, for example, it's very clear that they actually don't have enough revenues to subsidize other areas. And I think at the end of the day, then one needs to make pretty hard decisions. What service can be offered? Maybe some services needs to be put on hold for a while until there is revenue stream that is actually bringing in some profits that can then subsidize other services. So I know it's very hard work. And when people start, you don't really know. You can make as much analysis as you want, but unless you test it out and see who's willing to pay, how many customers you get, how much money comes in, it's really hard to say what is the best cross-subsidy model. So it's really action learning, testing by doing, and then having the right type of conversations and relationships with the donors always helps. So it is at least what I've seen all the donors I've worked in the past, from the grantees perspective, and now being a donor myself, it is our interest to work with our partners on the ground. It is our interest to train you as much as we can. At the end of the day, even with the bureaucracy, oftentimes it means that during those couple of years, you're developing a very good systems that you're going to be using in the long run. Maybe it seems a bit of an overkill at start, but then a couple of years later, you don't need to focus on strengthening your systems anymore, because your reporting and accounting and other systems are all pretty much state of the art. I hope so. Those were a few points that I just wanted to comment based on the earlier discussion here.
Great, thank you so much for bringing in the perspective of the other side. I think that's really helpful. Were there any reactions or any responses?
Hi, Mark.
I had one.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No. Go ahead, Mo.
Okay. All right. I wanted to thank. What's his name? Sorry. I see Gowitz. What's
Johnny.
Okay. All right. Well, I wanted to thank him. I mean, that was definitely a great perspective to bring into the conversation. What comes to mind is the diversity in bureaucracy from country to country. I don't know if you guys ever see Egypt in the headlines, but we're not exactly like in stable times right now, and this is very pronounced right now with the civil society sector, and it's been an issue even before the past few years, and starting with the revolution. What I want to say is that the bureaucracy that we dealt with, that we're dealing with, is a little bit over and beyond. But as he mentioned, like, we should have known this and what is entailed before going in. The problem is, like, in a country that's so unstable as Egypt, and with all the there's a new law every day that hinders so much progress in the private sector, civil society, definitely in the public sector. And so we were just like, boom. I mean, it was just in our faces, shocked with the amount of stuff that is required. But as time went along, there were more laws that were enacted, and it just, I mean, so this is a country-specific issue. And we asked GIZ how they're doing in Rwanda or in I don't know, wherever else, and it's nothing compared to what we have to deal with in Egypt. And so, but I mean, the comment that was made is very important. I mean, try as much as possible to know how much bureaucracy is involved, and then factor that into your work plan. and bring whoever on you need to bring so that the rest of your operations run smoothly. So I wanted to thank you for that comment for sure.
Yeah, a quick response to that is that obviously, when I spoke, my focus was with the bureaucracy that comes with the donor financing. So I know that there's bureaucracy also related to the local government fiduciary aspects, etc. But that's something that even every single business goes through. So it's basically the kind of there are bureaucratic hurdles, and I know that big donor organization and someone like ourselves as a part of the World Bank, as we follow certain procedures that many of the procedures we follow are the same for a very large scale, $100 or even billion-dollar projects. So it's just it's for us, it's a train stopper if a potential grant organization says that, well, this is too much bureaucracy. And I've had those cases as well where we've been told that, this is too much bureaucracy, we can't handle it. And then I've said that that's great. And it's my role also as a donor to educate and transparently inform the potential grant organization from as early as possible and tell what the hurdles might be. There's been I wanted to ask kind of your views because there's many of the hub managers that I haven't actually spoken to before. How do you see the kind of a balance in terms of long-term financing and short-term financing when and the roles of not the donor community but the government, as well as secondly the private sector. So for example, I've seen models where some labs are utilizing all three sources of support or a grant. So they've actually got into discussions and into joint initiatives with the government. They have private sector companies who are either providing sponsorship or they're doing some joint events as well, and then they've actually worked with donors. On the other hand, there has been labs or hubs that have only cornered with the government and donors, and then there's examples where government has been kept at an arm's length. So I wanted to get some views from you as well. How do you see in your when you're talking about programmatic funding or short-term funding, the sort of a different support channels outside of the typical revenue generation of fees for services?
I guess Tony, are you directing that towards me, or maybe Michael wants to give that a shot? I can answer if you want.
Go ahead. It wasn't particularly addressed to anyone. It was more of I just noticed these different models here, and since you guys are all in different environments, I've noticed that it's very useful to hear comments about also funding sources outside of the donors and the paying customers, but looking at the private sector as well as the government in some cases.
Okay, I don't want to take too much time. I think I've been talking a lot. I'm just going to answer this really. Again, in Egypt, we're on the verge of a failed state. So this country's been broke for many years, and in the last few years, they have even less reserves. So there's been absolutely no support whatsoever from the government and any of the any players and the stakeholders of the ecosystem. When it comes to other forms of support, the civil society here and the civil sector has been very strong here for the past 15 or 20 years. I think Egypt's place and the socio-political, situation that it's in has attracted a lot of donors here over many years. And so this has been the source for many entities with some private sectors, private investor support, where there's less than, and then private sector a little bit through like foundations of the billionaires in town, but not quite as much from multinationals. Even though PricewaterhouseCoopers runs around the ecosystem a little bit from Philips Innovation Department, etc. But just to answer your question, it is almost always international aid agencies. I don't know, maybe Michael wants to give this a shot as well.
Thanks, Mahmoud. The, the, the point maybe I would like to raise at this juncture is that since we have been working with the university that's a proxy to the government, things have not always been straightforward. You know, when you are working for one of the subsidiary of the government, the assumption is that the support from the government is just direct. But at the end of the day, you find they make a lot of promises which they don't keep at the end of the day. So for you to run a business seamlessly, you need to figure out ways that actually are more independent on top of what government has promised, because it might take years to be implemented. And as all we know that government works with the financial years. So if they promise something this year, it may be implemented in the next 1 or 2 years. So in the meantime, what do you do? So in our case, we just decided to, as I mentioned earlier, to leverage on our strengths. And that is the knowledge that we have, and we see how we can work with other partners who might make use of that knowledge. And that has been actually working out well. But to some extent, you find that is not so good, because the knowledge you use, you have to pay for. And actually, it's very expensive. So you find you don't have something to save and maybe innovate more, or venture into the new world of what you have not tried before. So we are actually striking a balance between what we are getting from all these initiatives and what we can get from the government. And it's very interesting that the university itself now has like tried to help us implement the innovation policy, whereby we are working in different projects. One of them is where they are setting aside an incubation and startup fund, which we can use to facilitate some of our projects and to hire more people who will help these things go hand in hand. But you cannot actually rely on that fully, because it's not something that actually is guaranteed for next 5 years. It might just be 1 year and it's done. So the only way you can be able to have a longevity of innovation and sustainability, in our case, I find it's encouraging more innovation amongst our startup, more innovation in our researchers, and just bridging those gaps, because we believe also if the startups that are incubated, if they succeed tremendously, they might come back to be our fund partners, whereby they might understand what actually we are going through more than even the government can understand. That's why we are actually trying to put our energy coming here, that is 2015, and see how it goes, maybe by June, and then we can see how we can work more ways to generate. So as of now, there is no sure way, there is no straight card that is a winning card. We're just trying everything that is on our disposal and see how it goes. So that's my take. But actually, I appreciate that Tony mentioned about putting in place the bureaucracy that exists. Actually, amongst you all, from the way you are speaking, I think you said Addis actually is transitioning from the university to the public. I think there are many hurdles we have to jump, but for on our side, we are trying to accommodate people who actually understand that the bureaucracy doesn't work, but you have actually to exist in that bureaucracy, but in a way work with it, knowing that anything is possible, and we can be able to accommodate it in our program. So I think that actually is working so far, and we're trying to leverage on that, because it's a good thing in one way that you are able to plan and you're able to be facilitated by the relevant institution, and you're able to partner to do most of the things without any problem. But also it takes long to implement some of the of the things that you need to implement faster. So yeah, I agree with Tony. We need to put to consider bureaucracy in our schedules and programs.
I wanted to maybe add a few comments based on what I've heard from hubs in terms of engagement with the private sector and government. In terms of the private sector, there have been a couple of hubs who have engaged quite successfully. One example is CTIC Dakar. So CTIC is a public-private partnership, so engagement with a government and association of, I guess you'd call them entrepreneurs, and the private sector is part of their governance structure, which is an interesting way of kind of embedding those interests in your actual model. But CTIC, for example, has worked successfully with telco operators to have them sponsor their events. And Jan, in a previous Hangout, had actually said, what we do is actually plan out our events, our entire calendar of events in advance, and then we go to a variety of companies and say, well, which event do you want, and in what, at what level, because obviously you can have different sponsorship levels. They've also provided value-added services to, actually I'm not sure whether it's corporates or donors, but theme-based accelerators, for example. So they've done an accelerator focused on open government, for example, for a funder. So the idea is that they've created kind of like white label products for, it might be funders, not private sector, in which case I apologize for putting that in. And then iHub, for example, has done a really good job of sourcing corporate sponsorships that also cover operational funding. So they actually have a corporate sponsorship package whereby they collect X amount, maybe it's $20,000. And some of that goes to the actual running of the hub, and it also gives corporates access to the development community. In terms of government, I've heard, unfortunately, fewer examples of how to engage government successfully. But I do know that CTIC, again, is a public-private partnership, so the government is part of what they do. But I think they spend a lot of time, a significant amount of time, building that relationship and showing up to the office and communicating what they were doing before they got government buy-in. And then also, I think MLab South Africa has received a good amount of support from the government. I'm not 100% sure how that has worked and what services they're providing to government in exchange, but I know they've done that. Whereas in contrast, Bongo Hive has struggled with working with the government. So again, it's sort of an example of one size doesn't fit all. Yeah.
And that's actually a good point, Tayo, and I don't want to focus on this particular aspect for too long, but especially engaging with the government, a couple of suggestions for the hubs to think of. I do agree with Mr. Michael, who said that you shouldn't see it as the core revenue stream. For sure. I mean, the best way to build your core revenue stream is to look at who your paying customers are, preferably your members. If you're doing pre-incubation or incubation services, then figure out what is the success sharing model. If you're, for example, incubating a company who becomes successful, is able to raise seed financing, is really grows out of the hub or the lab. Now try to figure out how can one benefit from that? CTIC in Dakar, they're using a royalty model. I know that some of the labs have started experimenting with equity. It's hard in many of these markets. Exits are extremely difficult, but it's something that, for example, as InfoDev, will be now looking into that success sharing aspect even more. We've been supporting many labs in terms of building their own revenue models around the success sharing. But I think the next year or so we'll also be doing a study around success sharing models for different business enablers that then looks at revenue, royalty sharing models or equity models, etc. across different markets. But in particular about the government, and South Africa is a good example. I would really suggest that many of the governments, they are now having the agenda of growing their private sector. There's a competitiveness agenda. There's cities agendas, and all of that growth means that they need to support entrepreneurship. So that's one opening to get in there. Now, oftentimes what I've seen in the past, the easier way to get in, many of the governments are currently having open data discussions. And they need some people on the ground to be able to run experiments, innovation competitions, etc., etc. And this is the perfect type of opportunity for the hubs to become a partner and a service provider for the government, to say that, you know, we can run it for you. We are the specialists in this area. We have the communities, so we can make it very easy for the government to actually start building that open data area. Another area in a similar manner is just the typical enhanced service delivery in the countries. So oftentimes pro-poor services, services in local languages, things. Think of all types of services that the corporates are not yet bringing on the table, where you really need the local innovators to try to disrupt markets. So, for example, in South Africa, I know that the MLab has run innovation challenges for local entrepreneurs and innovators. Initially challenges, giving prizes, and then as a part of the deal with the government, they've then selected a couple of best teams to be incubated in the lab. And this has been paid by the government. So for me, that model has worked very well. In similar manner as what Tayo said, they do have a good relationship with the government, and it's not for everyone. But those of you who don't think that involving the government is not a bad thing, and oftentimes it's not a bad thing, as long as you make it clear that in your governance model, for example, you want to have more of the community and the private sector say and the industry say, rather than having a government-steered hub. And the third aspect that you can also use as a hub when you're engaging with the government is really youth employment. This is a great sector to get youth involved. Many of the governments are really struggling to find jobs for the youth. So a couple of topics that you can build your discussions with the government, wrap it around your own service model, see how it goes. And the couple of labs that I've worked with who engage with the government, for them it has become, it's not a lifeline of funding, but it's a really good additional funding, even if it's programmatic funding at the end. So a couple of cents from my side.
Great. Well, thank you all. I think we might actually have to wrap up. I'm not sure. We're running a little bit over time. I'm not sure if people have other commitments. But maybe sort of as a final question, and to come to a conclusion, or to some sort of conclusion, what are the main challenges, and what can we do to overcome them? So what are the main challenges in getting funding? I think achieving the switch from being reliant on donors to diversifying income is sort of one of the big challenges we've identified. I think another challenge is sort of diversifying fund between different sources of funding, so between the government and its expectations, corporate funders and their expectations, and then foundations and donors and their expectations, and managing all that. But perhaps sort of we can also think a little bit about, okay, where do we go from here, and what would be helpful, especially to people who are managing hubs or who are on the donor side. What would be helpful to further understand and to perhaps find solutions to and talk about.
So I think Tayo probably has a lot to say about that. She's got a pretty big overview about what we all been facing, and probably could summarize it. I think she probably already has it in one of those awesome documents she sends to us. And I'm not going to talk about ICE Cairo, but it's just a loaded question there, Marlon, and trying to answer it, I'm already like, wow. There's a lot of challenges that I think we all face, and I think, but the best way to really like approach this from especially from our side right now where we're like really at a crunch time is really to find out the value that we need to that the value that we can provide to our community and to the ecosystem. And if we actually do provide that value, then we will not have a problem being financially self-sustained. We're convinced about this. Anyways, but I'd like to hear Tayo comment on this question because she's not only written about it, she speaks very well about it. So, what do you think, Tayo?
Thanks, Mo. I have a couple of comments. In terms of primary challenges, I think there are several. One, and this has come up multiple times, is existential. So it's knowing what business you're in, and your answer to that question could change depending on what type of hub you are, what you learn by virtue of experimentation, and what you then decide your new strategic approach is if you have to pivot. But knowing what business you're in and checking in periodically to ensure that you're still on the right track, I think, is essential. And it's a challenge to do that because hubs are operating in rapidly evolving environments, and your initial assumptions when you start may prove to be invalid. In which case, you have to sort of go back to the drawing board. I think another challenge is being able to do a proper assessment of your ecosystem, which is basically what you just said. So who are all the players? What are the value exchanges? Are you getting money, or can you generate revenue from those based on the services you want to provide? So again, if you're a public good hub, your map of stakeholders is going to look very different from an accelerator model. And so you have to sort of strategize around that. I think another big challenge, and I hate to harp on this, particularly when it comes to funders, is actually budgeting in the cost of bureaucracy, in the sense that the World Bank does a study of the doing business environment, and it says, well, it takes X number of days to register a startup. You need to know these regulations or what have you. There's a cost of doing business as a nonprofit, frankly. If you are applying for funding to multiple donors, you're dealing with multiple stakeholders. So there's a way in which sometimes I think you have to educate your donors in terms of allowing you to budget for that cost. So there's a way in which there's an emphasis sometimes on paying for impact, but people have to generate impact. So if you, as running ICE Cairo, need to add a program manager to fill out all of these documents and to register things, then that should be an acceptable cost, as opposed to sort of, your overhead is too high. So I think there's a tension in terms of that dialogue. In terms of things that we can practically do, there were two suggestions that were actually made to me, as from the network, but then also from the last Hangout. So John Gosier, who founded Hive Collab, basically said from a network perspective, AfriLabs should really be engaged in helping or in encouraging hubs to engage in this, basically articulating your business as early as possible. So have people actually draw out a P&L statement or a business canvas or a business model from the outset, and have them keep checking back to see whether their assumptions remain valid or not. And as part of that, someone also suggested that we have something like a business model canvas party, because I kind of feel like the answers are here. I know that sounds really silly, but I actually think collectively we have the answers. What we don't have is a mechanism to draw them out in a way that they're transparent and the information is easy to use. So I think we need to figure out how to do that. I don't know if that's more Hangouts. I don't know if it's a massive database of business models, but I think collectively the answer is within the community. We just really need to find a way to bring the answer to the surface. So that was a lot of talking, so I'm going to stop talking now.
Great. Well, I think those are some very interesting conclusions. I guess one addition I have is also talking about failure. I mean, we talk a lot about failing fast with startups, and I think innovation hubs are also startups in a way. I'm not sure if we've seen any real failures, and I think part of why this discussion is so difficult is also because there's funding models are very context specific in themselves always, and that means not just the external context which we've talked about a lot, but also obviously the internal context. Who's actually working in these places? What are their mindsets? Who are the founders? What is this hub trying to do? And I think talking about what hasn't worked and hubs that have struggled is also, I think, a helpful potential way forward to really tease out, well, okay, what is the answer or one of the answers to achieving financial sustainability? But I'm also not sure if that means more hangouts or how to move forward.
I agree, actually, Marlon. I think surfacing insight into what hasn't worked is arguably as important or more important than focusing on what has worked. I think, though, a precursor to that is figuring out how to create a safe space to talk about that, not just among hubs themselves, although that's incredibly important, but also with stakeholders and donors who have arguably a stake in seeing success. The problem is, though, you also, there's a way in which supporters also need to be prepared and willing to fund failure. And the system isn't really set up to accommodate that. You know, you're supposed to develop a proposal with objectives, and at the end of 2 years, you're supposed to have met them. And if you don't meet them, you've failed and you don't get any more funding. So if you're not allowed to structure your project as an experiment, and not to say that accountability shouldn't be incorporated, but if you're not allowed to structure your project as a learning experiment, like, you know, I don't have the answers, but I'm really motivated to get them. Here's my hypothesis. By the end of this project, hopefully I'm right, but at the minimum, I'm learning something that will help all of us get to the next stage more efficiently. But yeah, if we could have a little bit more leeway for funding failure and then talking about it without sort of being outcast as a result of doing so, I think that would facilitate the process a little bit.
You know, Marlon in the beginning spoke about how the constraints of funding in general, and if we're looking at how the international aid agencies and what Tony had brought up earlier, someone had brought it up, that there needs to be accountability, and these are taxpayers. Yeah, Tony said it, it's taxpayers' money. So it's extremely sensitive, and for good reason. I mean, there's already been a history of corruption, I know, in Egypt, and that's why we have extreme measures in order to, the accountability for funding. But you know, it must be the case, I think, right now, and just out of the top of my head, I mean, when startups get invested, private investors and private investment, they have much more leeway to experiment, to pivot, right? Whereas so this would be one of the constraints of funding from donor agencies that are tied in with governments, like our situation, or the World Bank, for example, where there has to be accountability and they don't give you that much room to pivot, whereas that's absolutely key. And someone else, Bahia or someone mentioned that we are entrepreneurs. Yeah, we're supporting entrepreneurs, and we are entrepreneurs. We need that freedom to find where we fit within our ecosystem. It's absolutely crucial. And without that leeway, then we're really stuck between a rock and a hard place.
So maybe that's also then an issue of figuring out, having so refining our understanding of our partners' constraints and what they can and cannot do. So maybe, for example, if you're funding some sort of like crazy radical experiment, then you need not apply to the government for that. That maybe, you know, you think about crowdfunding or private investors or successful entrepreneurs or what have you, but if you have something more stable with kind of like a predictable return on investment, like you're hosting a training or something, so something that certain donors are used to, then you go to them with that portion. So this idea of having diverse funding streams and being really clear about what each stakeholder needs and delivering that without expecting one to do everything has come up multiple times, and maybe it also applies here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting that you bring this up, because for some time now, and hopefully in 2015 we'll achieve this objective, but it's the Fab Lab in a box. And what we want to do is set up a bunch of different universities in Egypt with a functioning Fab Lab. But in order to do so, we need to do a little bit of R&D and really build up these open source machines. And we want to do this so that it's affordable to the public sector, to the Ministry of Education. And so in order to get that far, we're going to have to tap into the private sector, internationally and here in Egypt. And then later on, we're going to talk to the public sector and say, hey, set up these Fab Labs, and it costs this much, and everything's going to be super outlined, and you know, to minimize variability as much as possible so that it becomes more attractive. So yeah, I mean, that was a good point about this cross subsidy. Yeah, Labcraft, good call, Akira. That's Henrik. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty new to this arena, and I should introduce myself. I'm Akira, and I apologize for coming in super late. But I'm based in Cambodia, and I'm related to this sort of a hub. It's actually a project. With a timeline, time limit to it. It's a 3-year project with the USAID, so we're fully donor-funded project, and the sustainability is sort of the actual lab portion of it. It's just a part of the project, and it's a sort of an ad hoc issue for us, the sustainability of the lab itself. But I feel like the biggest challenge that we all face is sort of how we could make our sort of achievement or the metrics that we're trying to achieve visible and easier to understand to the people, maybe in the government, or maybe in the private sectors, or maybe, you know, and I think we gravitate towards the sort of tech solutions, the widgets that come out of these places, or like the sort of the, you know, maybe the successful startups or something like that. But I feel like if we focus too much on those things, we kind of are shooting ourselves in the foot, depending on what sustainability means to us. As far as fostering the community and creating a sort of an environment or ecosystem, those obvious signs of successes may not be the ones that we should really focus on or push. I don't know, you know, if you guys have any perspective on that.
I guess if no one else has a comment, I'll just very quickly say that I agree with this idea of needing to, assuming I understood correctly, translate our impact via metrics a bit more clearly. The Impact Hub network, and I don't know what their impact assessment framework and reporting looks like in detail, but I've had conversations with those folks, and one thing they've done successfully, and this is part of their strategy, is to define very clearly what their impact is, so they can talk about how many jobs have been created and how many businesses have been started and how much knowledge has been transferred, etc. And I know talking in these terms becomes very difficult because depending on what type of hub you have, so I don't want to suggest that these specific metrics are the way to go, but I think taking it upon ourselves to define this and to communicate this would actually go a long way to solving the sustainability problem, because part of it arguably is a communication and alignment problem.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I agree that impact hubs do a really good job of sort of making their impact visible. I think we could all look at their model and learn a few things. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I'd also agree with the importance, Akira, of what you said. Just from our experience, we tried for about a year to explain to people what ICE Cairo does. And, you know, back in 2012, it was, I mean, co-working was beginning to be understood. It wasn't, I mean, there was a few hundred people in this 20 million person city that were aware of it. So, but then other things that we were doing, there was a handful of people. And so it was extremely hard to explain all these things at the same time. And so after 1 year, we came out with the impact report and what we'd achieved at that point, including how many businesses we have start up, some social media metrics and a bunch of other things, and our key partners. And then people began to really understand, oh, okay, this is. So we demonstrated by action and using some solid metrics, and then people were like, okay, let's sit down. We actually now want to collaborate with you. So from our personal experience, it's absolutely crucial to come up and yes, Tayo, I mean, since there's different models and different roles for each people within the ecosystem, then each one has to find and make up your own metrics. But yes, definitely to kind of like narrow it down to help people understand and to summarize.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think I pretty much agree. I also think it's important when we think about metrics and measuring impact to keep sight of the entrepreneurs and people that are using hubs. I remember when I spoke to a couple of entrepreneurs in Nairobi, they told me that they started feeling like they were sort of in this technology zoo, and these animals that were being showcased and shown around, and sort of I think it's a balance to strike also in defining metrics, but leaving room for people to actually, to go about their business, obviously, but also I think entrepreneurship in itself requires uniqueness, and I think I think that's it's difficult to put that then into metrics and to sort of put everything into the same group everyone together when really a successful entrepreneur is unique and crafts something new. And I think that's a challenge also to to finding metrics that actually measure the impact that's happening and not just the impact that's sort of clearly visible.
Yeah, I used to be pretty active in the co-working sector, and like sort of like the smaller, not government supported or any sort of like civil society thing, but it's just like co-working spaces. And one of the things that they always talk about is that the community is what makes their spaces successful. And it sounds incredibly like it's just a warm, cuddly that's really hard to talk about or measure or put in numbers or visible ways. And it's a great point that you just mentioned. That when we focus on the things that the outsiders get excited about, the people inside start to feel like they're being used to kind of showcase things that aren't relevant to them, and that I think there's a balance to strike there.
This point about metrics, not to go on forever about it, but I think it's important because of what we mentioned earlier. So in order to circumvent a lot of the inconveniences that you guys are talking about, which are very real, we had dreamed. So I can't say we actually accomplished, but it's not too hard. I mean, we're in a maker community, and you can easily, there's really low-cost solutions for RFID and a bunch of other stuff to monitor the kind of activity within a hub that could be used for any metric. So if you're in a co-working space, for example, I mean, to measure the amount of hours that someone uses within the space, these kind of like low-level metrics are easily, they're not very intrusive, and I think can go a long way with some really simple technology, low-cost technology. So this is what we've dreamt of because we felt like these would be really good metrics. However, we haven't really gotten around to it. We now do this kind of manually, which is an absolute nightmare. But anyways, I mean, is to be innovative in coming up with these things, because what you said is technology. That's a great term. Yeah, totally. Yeah, sure, Tyler. No, I mean, we can talk about it. There's a lot of different things we had in mind, just haven't been implemented, but they're really not that hard. Just because, I mean, from the level we're at and when I sit at, we're very aware of, what language to speak to, people like maybe from Tony's world, and to things that the GIZ definitely responds to. Yeah.
So yeah, great. There are definitely a lot of open questions, and I think a lot of very interesting themes that have started to emerge as we've drilled down in a couple of issues. Not sure if we should sort of conclude at this point, or if people feel that there are sort of other aspects that we haven't talked about. I'm pretty flexible, but it looks like people have sort of also other things to do.
I'm flexible too, but I see Mo has got to go. I didn't mean to rhyme that, and I suspect others might as well. But I'm open.
Yes, sorry, I have another meeting in a couple of minutes, so if we wrap up now, it would be better, but we can always set up another hangout, maybe at a later date.
Yeah, I think I should get going as well, but I would be keen to maybe continue the conversation on, in another hangout or maybe in other places, maybe, I don't know, like online forum somewhere or something like that.
Yeah, also nothing from my side to continue now. I just want to thank everyone, and if there are any further questions, etc., I can always take, have a one-on-one discussion either with the group of here or even people if someone has followed this discussion. So just let me know. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Well, in that case, thank you everyone for taking the time and also for sharing your insights and stories and making this discussion so interesting. I certainly learned a lot. I'm only beginning to get into this hub world, and for me, I learned a lot, and this is very useful. And I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion around sustainability, perhaps in another hangout or in another form. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marlon, for the great facilitation and the fantastic discussion. Again, thank you to all for joining. We're hoping to compile some key insights from all three Hangouts and post the recordings to all three Hangouts. And we'll also be discussing how we might continue the conversation in one way or another. So thank you to you all. Oh, I guess I should add that probably officially concludes the Hangout. Sorry, I should have sort of left that hanging. So thanks again, guys.